Welcome to week 5. This week, we're going to be discussing Jane Austen's Persuasion, which was published in 1817. You've been asked to read approximately the first half. So that means that we're continuing on with our historical exploration of health and literature. We began in the Middle Ages with Boccaccio's The Decameron. We moved on to the Renaissance with John Donne's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions. Last week, we examined the 17th and 18th century with Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And this week, we're moving into the late 18th and early 19th century, which is a period known as the Regency era. In addition, we're also moving on to a slightly different type of literature. All of the literature that we've read up until now have really been literature about specific health problems and illnesses. But Jane Austen's Persuasion is not explicitly about a health problem. It is basically a sort of comedic romance, but it features health issues, disabilities, illnesses, and injuries in a variety of different characters and ways. So it's utilizing health as a kind of literary technique to do everything from moving the plot forward to giving us insight into certain characters, to offering commentary about class, gender, and current events. I want to give you some background on Jane Austen. Jane Austen lived from 1764 until 1817. She died at the age of 41, which is actually pretty young for her era. A common misconception when people think about age span in history is that they think that everyone in centuries prior to our own lived very, very short lives. This is not, in fact, the case. If we're talking about the 18th and early 19th century, people's lifespans could be really pretty close to our own. Now, what tends to lower life expectancy when we're talking about population averages is that those averages have been derived by calculating and averaging out the age of death of everybody in the population. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a high incidence of child deaths from childhood illnesses. So if you could make it out of childhood, you stood a pretty good chance, if you were living in the 18th and 19th century, of making it into your 60s, 70s, and if you're a woman, even into your 80s. There's a couple caveats to that. That assumes that you don't pass away during your adulthood or your adolescence from an injury or another illness. And if you're a woman, it also assumes that you're able to make it out of your childbearing years without dying in childbed. But that wasn't really an issue for Jane Austen. She was single for all of her life. Now, at the time of Austen's death, she had published 4 full-length novels: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Mansfield Park. We think that she likely wrote Persuasion between 1815 and 1816, so really kind of just prior to when she had to stop writing because of illness. So up until about the age of 40, Austen described herself as being in very good health. Her health began to decline, and then she passed away at the age of 41. There's been a lot of speculation of what may have killed her. People have speculated everything from Hodgkin's lymphoma to Addison's disease to even accidental arsenic poisoning. We don't really know what killed Jane Austen, but here's what we do know. Her family published 2 of her shorter volumes right after her death that included Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. At the time of her death, she was a well-known novelist, and she was considered a reputable novelist. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, her reputation increased, and she really began to gain an unprecedented level of renown. And she's now held in the same regard that we might regard Shakespeare in, that she's considered really, one of the great British novelists, one of the great British authors, in her case, that of a British novelist. And her novels are known for being extremely complex, for being really witty and funny, and for offering an absolutely precise and in some cases sort of devastating exploration of her society, of the way that class worked, the way that gender worked, and also as offering commentary on popular events that were going on in her own lifetime. So that's background on Austen. I want to give you some background to what's going on in Persuasion in order to help you read the text. In particular, I want to focus on three areas. One is the way in which Persuasion interpolates the Napoleonic Wars. Second is the way that Persuasion comments on the class system in Britain. And third is the way that Persuasion interpolates sensibility, which is a sort of neurological concept in the 18th and 19th centuries. Let's take the first one. So Captain Wentworth and Admiral Croft and their other brethren from the Navy are returning from the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 to about 1815. And Britain is involved in those wars from 1808 to 1815, so about 7 years. The Napoleonic Wars are oftentimes considered to be one of the first total world wars. By that, I mean that it's fought on multiple continents, it involves a number of countries, and those countries are suffering absolutely devastating numbers of casualties and deaths because of this war. So that's the background on how what's been going on with Wentworth, Croft, Benwick, and Harville. In addition, when those captains and admirals return back home and return, into sort of small town society, what they're dealing with is the British class system, and this is something that is dealt with sort of at length in Persuasion. Basically, what Persuasion is showing is a contrast between two different ways of understanding, I would say, sort of social capital or class, that is socioeconomics, but also the way in which one is perceived and respected within society. Early 19th century Britain has a remarkably entrenched class system. It's not a caste system, but it's pretty close. At the same time, there begins to be a discussion that perhaps this entrenched class system, in which one's economics and social capital is largely based on one's family of origin, really should be giving way to a system in which one is rewarded and respected based on one's personal merit and initiative. So here's what's going on. First, we have an idea about class and society that is more conservative, is more historical, and that is an idea that is espoused by Sir Walter Elliot. Sir Walter Elliot argues and believes that one's gentility and worth are based on one's family. Now, the people that matter to Sir Walter Elliot, that is, the people that merit his respect, according to him, are two types of people. One are gentlemen, and one are respectable non-gentlemen. Now, a gentleman is someone who doesn't have to work for a living. And so he sort of divides those people into two different groups. The first and higher of those two groups are aristocrats, that is, members of the aristocracy of Great Britain. And that would be someone like Lady Dalrymple, who has very wide holdings of lands and rents, lots of money, and a kind of ancient and very, very high end title. The next group, which is slightly farther down, is the landed gentry, of which Sir Walter Elliot is one. So this group is not necessarily an aristocrat, but they're sort of the next step down. And like aristocrats, they also are people that hold social titles and also land. And that land is what they are essentially living off of. They're living off of rents collected on their lands. So that's one group. That's the group that Sir Walter Elliot really holds in high regard. The next group that he holds in some regard, but not the same amount, are respectable non-gentlemen. That would include sort of established, wealthy, non-titled families that are part of his community that also don't have to work. So that would be someone like Charles Musgrove, his son-in-law, and also the Musgrove family. And then the next group that might merit some of his respect are basically wealthy and distinguished war heroes like Admiral Croft. So that's sort of Sir Walter Elliot's world, right? That's the world that Anne Elliot grows up in. But what Anne Elliot runs into when she meets Frederick Wentworth is someone who, he believes that his gentility or his level of social respect should be based on his merit and initiative. In that category, which is the group of people that Wentworth comes to value, he would include people like Admiral Croft, obviously Captain Wentworth, Captain Harville, and Captain Benwick, people who have distinguished themselves for their bravery, for their service to their country, for their initiative, for their intelligence. So here is the problem with Anne and Elliot's marriage at the very beginning of the novel, or what they allude to, which has taken place in their teenagehood. Anne Elliot is the daughter of a gentleman. She doesn't actually hold a title herself, and she's not eligible to hold a title. Upon marriage, she would receive some kind of cash gift from her parents. It would be part of her dowry. But nonetheless, Anne Elliot's family still sort of matters in terms of who she marries, because Anne Elliot, as the daughter of someone who's titled, brings a fair amount of social capital into a marriage. That is, she brings a fair amount of social respect into a marriage, and then she would also be bringing some wealth. Captain Wentworth, on the other hand, comes from a family that does not have a title, and they do not have wealth. So he's someone that really has to make it on his own. But because he's going into the Navy, he has an opportunity to earn money. So there's two branches of the armed services that are at play here. We only hear about the Navy. The other one is the British Army. The British Army is a system by which people don't really rise out of their ranks unless they come from a family or unless they have connections. The Navy, though, was a branch of the armed services in the early 19th century out of which you actually could rise through the ranks based on your own merit and based on your own initiatives. In addition, then, so that's what Captain Wentworth has done. In addition, he's also gained a great deal of money. And here's the reason why. Captain Wentworth, because he's the captain of a ship, he has risen through the ranks to take over his own ship. During the Napoleonic Wars, those ships are making money by taking other ships prisoner. So when they do that, the ship that is the victor in that fight can essentially sell all the cargo on the other ship, and then they split that money. It's called prize money. Now, the amount of money that you gain from that prize depends on your rank on the ship. So the captain receives the largest amount of money, maybe the admiral receives a really large amount of money, all the way down to the lowliest deckhand. He's still going to receive some part of those profits, but it's going to be very small. So what's occurred is that Captain Wentworth, by taking so many ships prisoner, has amassed an enormous fortune. And that fortune, when he returns, when combined with his heroism, gives him a great deal of both actual capital and social capital. All right, so I want to talk about the last of the three background areas, which is the issue of health and persuasion, in particular sensibility. So there are lots of different characters in sensibility that have varying degrees of health problems. One of those groups is disabled veterans. It's part of how the work sort of registers the fact that the Napoleonic War is what's going on in the background. So the Napoleonic Wars, there were some medical advances that were taking place, including faster surgery times on naval ships. There were better hygiene measures. So while there were a great number of casualties, there also were a fair number of soldiers and sailors, that are returning home disabled, basically, in particular having received sort of amputations from various injuries that in earlier periods would have just died. However, for a soldier or a sailor to return home with a disability that prevents them from working means that they suffer an immediate sort of loss of income and the lifestyle with which that income is associated. And the reason why is that if you are retiring from the Army or Navy because of an injury, you'll be receiving veteran benefits in the 19th century, but they're not very high. In addition, if you're a sailor, you're also missing the opportunity to gain in that prize money. So you are reduced in your salary, and then you are prevented from earning money on top of what that salary would have been. So that's one group of people who are suffering from health problems. There's other people that are suffering from illnesses and a variety of injuries. And then the last group are people who are suffering from what we call sensibility. Sensibility is a kind of odd concept that we find in the 18th and 19th century. It sort of begins to gain cachet around the 1750s. It kind of starts to die out around the 1800s, but it still is part of the cultural imagination. So here's what sensibility is. Sensibility is a popular nerve theory in the 18th and 19th century that holds that some people have more finely wrought nerves than other people. So these people would be more strongly physically and emotionally impacted than others when viewing, hearing, or reading beautiful or emotionally affecting scenes. So by that, I mean that somebody who has a great deal of sensibility might more strongly feel and be more physically affected by, let's say, reading a great work of literature or a beautiful poem, seeing an incredibly beautiful or awe-inspiring natural sight, like the kind of sight that's featured in the image on the left-hand side, or even possibly seeing some kind of suffering. So, watching a poor widow and orphan, or, seeing, let's say, a horse from a horse and carriage being mistreated. So it's a kind of theory about nerves. So it holds that if you are someone who's more strongly affected by it, you will have a more strong emotional and physical response to these kinds of stimuli. Sensibility, though, is extremely inflected by ideas of both class and gender. And by this, I mean that women are thought to have more sensibility than men. It's not that men don't have any sensibility. It's just that men tend to have less than women. In addition, sensibility is thought to be something that people who are of a higher social class, in particular people who are gentlemen or the daughters of gentlemen, are thought to have more than people who are lower down on the social ladder. So there was a theory that held that, let's say you are a very well-educated woman, the daughter of someone who might be, a titled gentleman, or a wealthy member of society who comes from an old and respected family, you would have more sensibility and be more capable of appreciating aesthetic and sympathetic sights than someone who, let's say, is a peasant, or someone who is working for their living as an artisan, or even someone who has risen up the social ladder. But at the same time, sensibility also kind of exists on a spectrum. So sensibility becomes a marker of one's class, but it also can be a marker of one's disingenuousness. And this is how I kind of understand it. What I'm showing you is a kind of spectrum on which it exists. At the left-hand side is people that have sort of too little sensibility. That might be people like, but wouldn't like be solely people like, let's say like uneducated peasants or social climbers. So if you have too little sensibility, you will be associated with someone who is uneducated or maybe miseducated, not to be very sympathetic or not to really appreciate fine literature and music. People who have too little sensibility are considered unfeeling, maybe even a little coarse, and also people who are in bad taste. People who have the proper amount of sensibility would be people who are well educated, but also kind of properly educated to appreciate music, poetry, to sort of want to appropriately help the poor. So they would be considered people who are sympathetic and people who also have good taste. And then finally, on the opposite end of the spectrum, like the right-hand side, are people that have too much sensibility. So people with too much sensibility might be also people who are miseducated. They might be people who are really dramatic or really self-involved, people who might be really kind of affected So by that, I might mean that it's someone who might say, oh, I can't see, if I read this work of poetry, I'm surely going to faint because this is just going to overwhelm me too much. So what goes along with that then are people who are not just refined, but people that are actually so refined that they become just finicky. And then finally, because those kinds of people are considered sort of self-involved and over-refined, they're also ultimately associated with bad taste and with even a kind of sense of emotional coarseness. Okay, so that's the background to this week's discussion on persuasion. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.